They say the truth will set you free. They lied. The truth is a wrecking ball that waits until you've built a fortress of lies just to level it all. I thought I knew Illyria's soul. I thought I knew the way her hands trembled when she lied and the way she looked when she was hiding something. So when the files went missing, I didn't hesitate. I burned her world to the ground. I watched her pack her life into a single cardboard box while security stood over her like vultures. I wanted her to hurt as much as I did. But tonight, the rain isn't the only thing hitting the glass. A single confession just landed on my desk. A recording that proves she didn't betray me. She saved me. And while I was busy playing the executioner, she was bleeding out in silence to keep my name clean. Now, I'm standing on her doorstep in a storm she didn't deserve, realizing that the Roman statue everyone feared wasn't made of stone. It was made of glass. And I just shattered. Hello, my beautiful family. I'm so glad you are here. However this day found you, whether it was kind or whether it asked too much, I want you to know this space was made with you in mind. Set it all down for a little while. You are safe here. If this is your first time with us, welcome home. You are already family. Like, subscribe and say hello in the comments. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. It means everything, and it is the only reason these stories get to keep living. Now get comfortable, get something warm, and give yourself full permission to just be here, because today's story is not a small one. It is about a man who built his life out of certainty, and the woman he destroyed before he understood what she was worth. Take a breath. Let's go. The cardboard box had not been a large one. That was the thing Balthazar kept returning to in the days that followed. Not the moment itself, not her face, but the smallness of the box. 7 years of Illyria's soul reduced to a single rectangle of corrugated brown, and still it had not been full. He had watched through the security feed on his laptop, the way a man watches a controlled demolition, from a distance with the clinical appreciation of someone who ordered the charges himself. She had moved through her office with a quiet that unnerved even the security escort, who Balthazar noticed kept his eyes averted from her face. She did not cry. She did not argue. She simply collected the 3 or 4 items she apparently considered worth carrying out. A small succulent in a terracotta pot, a leather-bound notebook, a photograph he could not identify from the angle of the feed, and left without looking back. He told himself the tightness in his chest was satisfaction. He was almost certain he believed it. The week after her termination, the 43rd floor settled into a particular kind of silence. Not the productive silence of deep work, but the acoustic aftermath of an absence. The way a room sounds after a clock that has been ticking for years is finally stopped. Her office sat at the end of the corridor with the blinds drawn and the nameplate already removed, the wall bracket leaving a pale rectangle where it had been, like a scar from something extracted rather than replaced. Balthazar did not walk past it. He took the long route to the elevator. The word reached him in increments, the way news about the professionally destroyed always does, through assistants who thought they were passing along irrelevant gossip, through industry contacts who mentioned it with the studied casualness of people who know exactly what they are doing. Illyria had been turned down at Mercer and Cole within 48 hours of submitting her application. Turned down at Holloway Group within the week. By the second Monday after her termination, a source he trusted told him she had stopped applying to firms in the city and had begun reaching further. Smaller houses, consulting roles, positions that would have been considered beneath her 3 months ago and were now apparently beyond her reach regardless. His name, attached to hers by way of her dismissal, was sufficient. The industry was small enough that it only needed to be said once. He told himself this was the natural consequence of what she had done. You do not sell a man's life's work and then expect to be employed in the same city, in the same field, in the same decade. He told himself she had made this bed with precision and patience, had smoothed its sheets and folded down its corners, and was now simply sleeping in it. He told himself all of this at his desk, at his dining table, and at 2 in the morning when the penthouse was quiet enough that he could hear the rain against the glass from 3 rooms away. He was a man who had never required a great deal of sleep. He required less now. The irony, though he would not have called it irony at the time, was that the company had not suffered. The merger data she had allegedly leaked had been contained quickly enough, and the rival firm who'd supposedly received it had made no visible move to leverage it. His lawyers attributed this to fear of litigation. His head of security attributed it to the information being less actionable than originally feared. Balthazar nodded at both of them and said nothing, because neither explanation troubled him in the way the lack of consequence did. Betrayals were supposed to wound. This one had left the patient standing. He promoted a junior analyst named Ewan into Illyria's position on an interim basis. Ewan was capable, thorough, prompt, technically sound, and Balthazar found himself reading his reports twice, then 3 times, searching for the second layer of insight that had once been simply there, woven into the fabric of every document that had passed across this desk for 7 years. It was not there. It was not Ewan's fault. Balthazar was not certain it was a thing that could be taught. There was a moment on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week when he opened a quarterly risk analysis that Illyria had submitted before the firing. Still in the system, pending his final sign-off, and sat with it for longer than he meant to. The margins were clean. The logic was seamless. And somewhere in the 3rd section, a footnote flagged an exposure in the Hartwell subsidiary that none of his other analysts had flagged before or since. He stared at the footnote for a long time. Then he forwarded the document to legal, closed the file, and went to stand by the window. The city was doing what it always did, moving, accumulating, unbothered by the private catastrophes of the people who occupied its towers. Balthazar pressed 2 fingers to the cold glass and watched the street below until the shapes blurred and he was looking at nothing in particular, which was, he was slowly realizing, exactly what he had been doing for 3 weeks. The pleasure he had anticipated, the clean, hard satisfaction of consequence delivered, had arrived on schedule and then quietly departed, leaving behind something with no good name. Not guilt. He was certain it was not guilt. He was less certain about what it was. Her office at the end of the corridor held its silence. The pale rectangle on the wall where her nameplate had been caught the light at certain hours in a way that was difficult to ignore. He took the long route to the elevator. Every time, it had begun, as most things between them did, with a problem that should not have existed. The Ardennes acquisition had been 18 months in the making, a slow, surgical dismantling of resistance across 4 countries and 2 regulatory bodies. The kind of deal that required the particular intelligence of someone who could hold the entire architecture of it in their head at once without losing the thread. Balthazar had that intelligence. So, it turned out, did Illyria Soul. The difference was that he had always known it about himself and had spent the better part of 2 years being quietly, reluctantly educated about it in her case. It was a Wednesday in late November. He remembered this with the involuntary precision of a man who has since tried very hard to forget it. The building had been empty by 9, the kind of empty that only midweek deadlines produce, when entire floors vacate at once and the offices left behind feel borrowed, like spaces between one thing and the next. He had been in the boardroom on 43 with the acquisition documents spread across the long table, working through a clause in the Ardennes liability framework that his legal team had flagged as a potential exposure, when he heard her. Not footsteps, just the soft percussion of her keyboard 2 offices down, that particular, slightly uneven rhythm he had apparently memorized without ever deciding to. He had not called her in. He wanted to be clear about that, even now, even in the privacy of his own recollection. He had not called her in. She had simply appeared in the boardroom doorway at 10:30 with 2 cups of coffee from the machine on the floor below, set one on the table approximately 18 inches from his elbow, and looked at the documents spread before him with an expression he had learned to translate over time. Not curiosity, exactly. Recognition. The look of someone encountering a problem they have already been quietly solving in the background. The liability clause, she said. Not a question. He had looked at her for a moment. Go home, soul. She picked up her own cup. The exposure isn't in the clause itself. It's in the indemnity schedule. Section 4, Subclause C. The language creates a contingent obligation that doesn't appear in the main body, but compounds against the Hartwell holdings if the acquisition triggers the revenue threshold within 18 months. She paused. Which it will. He looked at the document. He looked at her. Sit down, he said. She sat. What followed was 3 hours that Balthazar had since mentally classified, revised, reclassified, and finally simply sealed behind a door he chose not to open. Not because the memory was painful in the way that memories of loss are painful, but because it was the opposite. Because it was the clearest he had felt in years, and clarity, in his experience, was always the thing that cost the most. They had worked through the liability framework together the way 2 people who have long operated in parallel finally find themselves operating in the same lane, with the slightly startled efficiency of it, the adjustment of speed and distance. She thought differently than he did. Not incorrectly, differently. Where he approached a structural problem from the apex down, she came at it from the perimeter inward, mapping the edges before she named the center. The result, when their approaches converged on the same conclusion from opposite directions, had the quality of something proved rather than merely decided. At some point after midnight, he had leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and said, "Where did you see the Hartwell connection?" And she had said, "I've been watching it for 6 weeks. I didn't want to flag it until I was certain." And he had turned his head and looked at her across the table and said nothing for a moment because the sentence had reached him differently than it should have. She had been watching it for 6 weeks, without being asked, without recognition or instruction or any guarantee that the information would land anywhere useful. She had simply seen a thing and continued seeing it, quietly in the background of everything else, because that was apparently the kind of person she was. He remembered the precise quality of the silence that followed. The rain was doing something against the boardroom windows. Not the dramatic percussion of a storm, just the steady, uninflected presence of it. The kind of rain that asks nothing and simply continues. She was looking at the document. He was, for several seconds that he did not intend, looking at her. There was a line. He was aware of it in the abstract way that men who have spent years building precise lives become aware of the edges of things. Not because they intend to step off, but because awareness of the edge is what keeps the structure sound. He was aware of it the way he was aware of the 43 floors beneath his feet when he stood at the window. Present. Unambiguous. Not a thing to be tested. He looked back at the document. "The clause needs to be rewritten," he said. "I'll have legal take the framework we've built tonight and reconstruct the indemnity language before the morning session. I can have a draft to you by 6, she said, as if the previous 15 seconds had not occurred. And perhaps for her they had not. He could not be certain. He had told himself afterward that he could not be certain. She had the draft on his desk by 5:47. He had not mentioned the night again, and neither had she, and the acquisition had closed without incident 4 months later, The Hartwell exposure contained so neatly within the revised framework that his legal team had congratulated themselves on catching it. Balthazar had said nothing to correct them. Neither had Illyria. That was the thing he returned to now, standing by his penthouse window 3 weeks after watching her carry a cardboard box out of the building she had quietly held together in ways he was only beginning to map. Not the almost. Not the rain or the silence or the 15 seconds he had revisited against his own explicit instructions, but the draft on his desk at 5:47 in the morning. The 6 weeks of watching the Hartwell connection before she said a word. The fact that she had set the coffee 18 inches from his elbow. Not close enough to intrude, not far enough to be indifferent. As if she had spent some time thinking about the precise geometry of his space. He had taken all of that and built a clean, coherent portrait of a woman who understood his world well enough to move within it invisibly. A woman who knew the seams of his empire because she had helped stitch them. And then, when the files went missing, when the evidence arranged itself into a shape that pointed in one direction, he had looked at that same portrait and decided it was a blueprint. That everything she had learned about the architecture of his company had been inventory. That the coffee and the Hartwell clause and the 547 draft had all been patience, and patience, in his experience, was the primary instrument of the long betrayal. He had been so certain. That was the part that sat in him now like a stone in still water, settled and cold and refusing to dissolve. The rain had returned. It was always returning. It pressed against the penthouse glass the way it had pressed against the boardroom windows on that Wednesday in November, steady and uninflected, asking nothing. He stood in front of it alone, which was, he supposed, exactly what he had chosen. It was Ewan who found it, which was perhaps the only reason Balthazar saw it at all. Ewan was not a man given to instinct. He was meticulous in the way that people who have survived on precision alone tend to be: careful, documented, allergic to the speculative leap. He cross-referenced everything. He footnoted his footnotes. Under ordinary circumstances, Balthazar found this mildly exhausting. On a Tuesday morning in the 4th week after the termination, sitting across from Ewan in the corner office with a revised competitor analysis open on the table between them, he found it briefly, unexpectedly useful. Ewan had been walking him through the Ardennes post-acquisition metrics when he paused, the way he always paused before saying something he had already rehearsed. "There's a discrepancy in the audit trail from the breach," he said. "I wasn't looking for it. I was cross-referencing the server access logs against the files flagged in the security report, and it appeared." He set a single printed page on the table. "I thought you should see it." Balthazar looked at the page for a long moment without touching it. Then he picked it up. The security report had been thorough. Mercer, his head of security, was constitutionally incapable of being otherwise, and it had placed Illyria's access credentials at the center of the breach with the kind of documentary confidence that left little visible room for doubt. Her login, her terminal, her access window opened at 11:43 on a Thursday night and closed 40 minutes later, during which time the merger files had been copied to an external pathway and routed out of the system through a proxy that Mercer's team had traced to a third-party server before the trail went cold. What Ewan had found was a timestamp. Specifically, a timestamp in the server access log that preceded the breach by 9 minutes and did not appear anywhere in the security report. A separate access event, brief, under 4 minutes, originating from a different terminal on a different floor. An access that had touched 3 of the same files before Illyria's credentials had opened the session at 11:43. The files had been read, not copied. And then the session had been closed, and 9 minutes later, Illyria's login had appeared, and the sequence that Mercer's team had documented had begun. Balthazar read the page twice. Then he set it down with a care that was, in itself, a kind of reaction. "Where did the preliminary access originate?" he asked. "Floor 38, Ewan said. "The terminal hasn't been assigned since the restructure in July. It should have been inactive." "Should have been." "Yes." Balthazar looked out the window. The city was bright and indifferent. Did Mercer's team see this? Ewan was quiet for a moment. "The timestamp exists in the raw server log. It doesn't appear in the compiled security report. Whether that's an oversight or a—" He stopped. "I don't know what it is," he said precisely. "I only know what I found." Balthazar dismissed him. He sat alone with the page for a long time. The thing about a structure built on certainty is that it does not require a large crack to become unsound. It requires only the right one, the one that runs perpendicular to the load-bearing assumption, the one that, once seen, cannot be unseen. Balthazar had spent 20 years identifying these cracks in other people's architectures. He had built his empire in part by understanding, at the cellular level, that confidence and accuracy were not the same thing, and that the distance between them was where fortunes were made and lost. He had not applied this understanding to the case of Illyria's soul. He saw that now with a clarity that had the specific, nauseating quality of a thing that has been obvious for some time. He pulled the original security report from his desk drawer and read it in its entirety for the first time since Mercer had presented it. He had read the summary. He had read the executive conclusions. He had not, in the immediate fury of that first week, read the underlying methodology, the section that documented how the audit trail had been compiled, which logs had been pulled, and which had been considered outside the scope of the primary investigation. The raw server logs were listed as supplementary material. Appendix D. Mercer had noted them as corroborating rather than primary, given that the credential-based evidence was considered sufficient for the purposes of the report. Sufficient. Balthazar set the report down. He thought about Illyria, specifically about the version of her that existed in his memory before the version he had constructed in the weeks following the breach. The woman who had left the footnote about Hartwell in a quarterly analysis because she considered it necessary to note even the possibilities she wasn't yet certain of. The woman who had spent 6 weeks watching a contingent liability develop before she said a single word about it, because she did not speak until she was sure. He thought about the draft on his desk at 5:47 in the morning. He thought about the quality of her silence in the boardroom, which had never been the silence of someone concealing a thing, but of someone holding a thought carefully until it was ready to be offered. He thought about what it would have required for Illyria's soul to decide to betray him. Not the mechanics of it, the server access, the proxy routing, the external pathway, but the decision itself, the internal architecture of that choice. He had believed it because the evidence was clean and because his past had taught him that clean evidence meant you were looking at a professional. He had believed it because the alternative, that someone else had constructed the evidence specifically to point at her, required a level of premeditation that he had not wanted to assign to this situation, because assigning it meant asking who. And asking who meant beginning a different investigation entirely, one that led somewhere he had been avoiding since the morning the files were reported missing. His greatest rival had made 3 attempts in the past 2 years to access the Ardennes merger data through channels that Balthazar had quietly closed each time. The third attempt 8 months ago had been sophisticated enough that Mercer had flagged it as a significant escalation. Balthazar had noted this, increased the relevant security protocols, and moved on. He had not connected it to the breach because the breach had come with a name already attached. And when something comes with a name already attached, the mind does not go looking for another. His mind went looking now. He called Mercer. He did not explain the full context. He said there was an access event in the raw server logs from floor 38 that had not appeared in the compiled report, and he needed the terminal's activity history for the 6 weeks prior to the breach reconstructed and on his desk by morning. Mercer, who was experienced enough to hear the register of Balthazar's voice and understand that this was not a moment for procedural questions, said he would have it done. Balthazar ended the call and sat in the silence of his office. Outside, the city continued its accumulation. Below, the pale rectangle on the 43rd floor corridor caught the afternoon light at the angle it always caught it now. The absent nameplate, the drawn blinds, the closed door. He could not see it from here. He did not need to. The crack was there. It ran clean and cold through everything he had been certain of. And in the particular silence of that Tuesday afternoon, it was all he could hear. Mercer's reconstruction arrived at 6:14 in the morning, which meant he had worked through the night without being asked to. Balthazar noticed this the way he noticed most things about the people who worked for him, quietly, without comment, filling it into the ledger he kept about each of them. He opened the file at his dining table before the city had fully committed to daylight, with coffee he did not drink going cold beside him, and read. The terminal on floor 38 had not been inactive. It had been accessed on 11 separate occasions over the 6 weeks preceding the breach, always between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning, always from the same physical point of entry, a service corridor on the building's north side that bypassed the main security desk and fed into the freight elevator. The access events were brief, disciplined, and consistent in their target. The Ardennes merger files, the Hartwell subsidiary records, and a third cluster of documents relating to the post-acquisition revenue projections that Balthazar had shared with fewer than 8 people inside the company. Illyria Sol had not been among those 8 people. He read that line twice, set the report on the table, picked it up again. She could not have leaked what she did not have access to. The revenue projections, the most operationally sensitive of the 3 document clusters, had lived in a partition of the server that required a secondary clearance she had never been granted, because the role that required it had always sat one level above her position, a boundary Balthazar had maintained deliberately and which Mercer's original report had apparently not considered relevant to document, because the credential trail pointed to files Illyria did access, and the others had been noted simply as additionally compromised without examination of who could have reached them. She had been in the building on the night of the breach. Her credentials had opened the session at 11:43. Both of these things remained true. What the reconstruction made newly, inescapably visible was that the session opened under her login had not touched the revenue projections. Had not needed to, because the terminal on floor 38 had already extracted them 9 minutes earlier, using a method that Mercer's team now assessed, in a terse supplementary note appended to the bottom of the reconstruction, as consistent with credential mirroring, a technique that required physical proximity to the target device at some prior point, a length of preparation measured in weeks, and a level of technical sophistication that sat well outside the profile of a research director who had, in 7 years, never once been flagged for a security concern of any kind. At the bottom of Mercer's reconstruction was a single additional line, formatted with the careful neutrality of a man who understood the weight of what he was submitting. The access pattern on Terminal 38N is consistent with external orchestration. Recommend full forensic review. I should have caught this. Balthazar sat with that for a long time. The call came at 9:47, a number he did not recognize, which he would not ordinarily have answered, except that the prefix was from a private medical facility 2 hours outside the city, and something in the combination of the morning's evidence and whatever was still functioning in him below the level of conscious thought made him pick up. The man on the line identified himself as a physician. He was calling on behalf of a patient who had requested the call be made in the event of a specific medical development. The patient's name was Gerard Falk. Balthazar knew the name the way you know the name of a splinter you cannot reach, by the persistent, low-grade awareness of its presence. Falk had spent 4 years as a senior technology consultant to Harlan Voss, Balthazar's primary rival, before a falling out that the industry had noted with interest and quickly moved past. He had been, in the architecture of the last year, a peripheral figure, someone Mercer had flagged once and then set aside. The physician said that Mr. Falk had been admitted 3 weeks ago, that his condition had deteriorated over the past 48 hours in a manner that had prompted him to request this call be placed, that he had left a recorded statement to be transmitted to Balthazar Rowe specifically upon this development, and that Mr. Falk had been lucid and unambiguous about his wishes at the time of recording. The physician's voice was careful and even. He transmitted the file. Balthazar listened to it standing up, because he had risen from his chair at some point during the call without noticing and had not sat back down. Falk's voice on the recording was diminished, thinner than the industry photograph suggested it should be, with the effortful quality of a man spending his breath deliberately. But it was clear. It was precise. And it was the most expensive thing Balthazar had heard in 41 years of expensive information. Falk had designed the breach. Not Illyria. Falk, working on Voss's instruction, using 6 weeks of building-level access he had obtained through a facilities contractor connected to the North Service corridor. The credential mirroring had been applied to a device Illyria used during an all-staff technology audit 4 months prior to the breach, a routine event she had no reason to treat with suspicion and which Falk had arranged to be present at under a contracted vendor identity. Everything that followed had been constructed to produce a trail that ended with her name. The external proxy, the timing, the choice of her login, all of it architecture. The kind you build when you want a specific person to take the fall and you have enough time and access to make the ground beneath them convincing. But Illyria had seen something. This was the part where Falk's voice shifted. Not into guilt exactly, but into something adjacent to it, the register of a man confessing not because he had become good but because the alternative was taking it with him. She had noticed an anomaly in the server partition 2 days before the breach, an access irregularity that she had traced, with the same perimeter inward methodology that Balthazar now recognized from every document she had ever produced, to the terminal on floor 38. She had not yet identified Falk, but she had flagged the irregularity internally to the security partition and had begun documenting it. Falk had seen her documentation, and so he had moved the breach forward by 11 days before she could complete the picture, and had ensured that the session opened under her credentials was timed to occur on the same night she was in the building, working late, as she often did, on a quarterly review that her own access logs confirmed she had been in the middle of when his terminal completed its extraction 9 minutes prior. She had been in the building because she was trying to protect it. She had been at her desk, running the thread she had already begun pulling, while the trap she did not know existed closed around her access credentials 1 floor below. Falk's recording ended. The physician's line was silent. Balthazar stood in his penthouse with the city bright and enormous behind him, and the recording finished and the coffee cold and the morning fully arrived. And something happened in him that he did not have adequate architecture for. It was not a clean thing. It did not arrive with the structure of grief or the simplicity of rage, though both were present somewhere in its composition. It was the specific devastation of a man who has understood, in one sustained and terrible moment of clarity, the full ledger of what he has done. She had found the breach before it happened. She had been pulling the thread that would have named Falk, would have protected the company, would have, in the version of events that should have occurred, brought the evidence to his desk and laid it out with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. Instead, he had watched through a security feed as she carried a cardboard box to an elevator, and he had told himself the tightness in his chest was satisfaction. He set the phone down on the table. He stood very still for a long time. Then he went to find out where she was. He had not used Mercer's full resources before for something like this. He had used them for corporate intelligence, competitor mapping, due diligence on acquisition targets, the quiet background verification of people who were about to be trusted with significant things. He had used them twice for security threats that required a response below the threshold of formal law enforcement. He had never used them to find a woman who had simply and deliberately chosen not to be found, and the distinction sat with him in a way he did not fully examine as he gave Mercer the instruction on the morning after Falk's recording, in the flat and operational tone he used when he needed a thing done and did not wish to discuss it. Mercer had not asked questions. This was one of his more valuable qualities. What Balthazar had not anticipated was the waiting. He was, by design and long practice, insulated from most varieties of it. The structures of his professional life had been built specifically to minimize the gap between decision and outcome, between instruction and execution, and the residue of a life lived at that tempo was a deep and largely unconscious impatience with intervals he could not fill or control. He had 11 days of this. 11 days in which Mercer's sources were moving through the concentric circles of Illyria's absence. The canceled accounts, the disconnected number, the forwarding addresses that didn't exist, the professional registrations that had gone quietly dormant. And Balthazar was in his penthouse and his office and the car between them, doing the thing he was least equipped to do. He was sitting with what he had done. He attempted, in the first 3 days, to occupy the interval with work, which was his oldest and most reliable instrument for the management of interior weather. It did not work in the way it usually worked because the work kept returning him to her. Every document that crossed his desk was either something she had touched or something that would have benefited from her having touched it, and the distinction between those two categories was itself a kind of ongoing indictment. He approved a risk framework on the second day that he knew, reading it, was missing something in the third section, and which he approved anyway because identifying what it was missing required him to think in the way she thought, and he could not access that angle from the outside. He had never had to before. On the 4th day, he went to the 43rd floor for the first time since the termination. Not to her office. He was not ready for that, or not willing to examine whether he was ready, which amounted to the same thing. He walked the corridor at a pace that was deliberately professional, nodded at the two analysts who looked up from their desks with the careful blankness of people who had learned not to register surprise at his presence, and stopped at the window at the end of the hall. From here you could see a different quadrant of the city than the penthouse offered, lower, less panoramic, more granular, the specific texture of the streets rather than their general shape. He stood there for longer than he had intended. He thought about 11 days. He thought about what she had done with the information she'd found. The anomaly in the server partition, the 6 weeks of perimeter mapping she had apparently been conducting in parallel to her actual responsibilities, the internal flag she had submitted to the security partition before Falk had moved the timeline forward. She had been doing, in the weeks before the breach, what she always did. Seeing the thing before anyone else saw it and moving toward it quietly and without announcement, because that was the kind of intelligence she had, not the kind that required an audience. He had been the audience she didn't have. That was the role he had occupied in the corrected version of events, the person she would have brought it to when it was ready, when the picture was complete enough to present. He had been the destination of the information she was assembling when the trap closed around her name. He returned to the penthouse on the 4th evening and stood at the glass for a long time, watching the city do what it always did, and understood something about the shape of the debt that was clarifying in him by degrees. It was not simple. It was not the clean, bilateral architecture of a wrong and its correction, the filed report, the public statement, the cleared name. Those were necessary, and he would do all of them. But beneath the necessary things was something that didn't have a procedural solution, which was that he had failed her in the specific and irreducible way that you fail someone when you decide, in the face of 7 years of evidence, that you know exactly what they are. When you choose the story that fits your wound over the one that fits the facts. He could correct the record. He could not correct the choice. Mercer called on the 11th day, in the early evening, with an address and a brief summary of what his sources had established. Balthazar wrote nothing down. He did not need to. He thanked Mercer and ended the call and sat at his dining table with the information in him like a coordinate, fixed and specific, and thought about what came next. What came next was not a plan exactly. He was a man who operated on plans, who built them with the same structural rigor he brought to acquisitions, with contingencies and sequence steps and defined outcomes. He had tried, in the 11 days, to plan this, and had produced several versions of an approach and discarded all of them because each one, examined honestly, was designed more to manage the encounter than to be honest within it. Each one contained, somewhere in its architecture, a bid for a particular response, for the look on her face that would indicate the debt was movable, the weight liftable, the structure salvageable. He discarded the last version on the evening of the 11th day and did not replace it. What he had was the address. What he owed her was the unmediated fact of what he knew and what he had done and what he understood he had no right to ask for. He would go with those things and without a plan, and he would stand in front of her. Not behind glass, not through a security feed, not across the managed distance of the 43rd floor, and he would say it, and what happened after was not his to arrange. He found the car keys. He looked out at the city for a moment, which was already beginning to rain with the quiet consistency it had maintained throughout the worst weeks of his recent life, as if the sky had its own opinion about the proceedings and had decided to register it continuously. He drove. She had not made it easy to find her, which was itself a kind of answer to a question he had not known he was asking about her state of mind. No forwarding address filed with the building registry. No updated contact information with the professional bodies she was registered with. The number she had used for 7 years had been disconnected at some point in the 5th week. He did not know the exact date because the first time he called it was the night after Falk's recording, and it was already gone, already a flat electronic nothing where her voice should have been. Mercer had located her in 11 days, which he reported with the subdued efficiency of a man who understood he was participating in something he could not fully assess. A rented house 40 minutes outside the city, in the kind of town that does not appear in financial publications or industry directories, small, unhurried, indifferent to the categories of importance that had structured every room Balthazar had occupied for the past 2 decades. She had taken a short-term lease. She was, as far as Mercer's sources could determine, not working. She had not reapplied to any firm since the 7th week. Balthazar had not gone immediately. He told himself this was strategic, that arriving without preparation was a form of disrespect, that he owed her more than impulse. In truth, he was not certain what he owed her could be named or denominated in any currency he currently possessed, and the 11 days between Mercer's report and the night he finally drove out of the city were the longest he had spent inside his own company in recent memory. It was raining when he arrived. Of course it was. The universe, he had concluded, had a presentational instinct that bordered on the theatrical. He had not sent word ahead. He understood this was a choice that could reasonably be interpreted as cowardice disguised as spontaneity, the refusal to give her the opportunity to simply not be there when he arrived, which she would have been entirely within her rights to exercise. He parked on the street rather than the short drive, as if the additional 30 feet of distance constituted some form of restraint or penance, and walked to the door in the rain without an umbrella because he had left without one and had not stopped to acquire one and did not, on some level he was not fully examining, feel that he deserved the shelter. The house was modest and well-kept in the provisional way of a place someone is inhabiting rather than inhabiting. Light behind the front window, her silhouette briefly moving past it. He stood on the porch for what was probably 40 seconds and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he did not know what to do with his hands. He knocked. The silence that followed was long enough that he understood she had looked through the sidelight and seen him and was making a decision. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the few qualities he possessed that translated cleanly across every context he had ever occupied. But this variety of waiting was new, because in every previous instance he had waited with the confidence that the outcome was within his capacity to shape. He stood on her porch in the rain and waited with no such confidence, which was, he was discovering, an entirely different experience. She opened the door. She did not open it wide. A precise and deliberate distance, enough to indicate that she had chosen to engage rather than simply to refuse, not enough to indicate that the engagement would be easy or that he had been forgiven for requiring it. She was in dark clothing, a wool pullover and trousers, her hair not arranged the way it had always been in the office but simply itself, and she looked at him with an expression he had not seen before on her face because the office had never required it of her. It was not anger. Anger would have been, he realized, a form of continued investment. This was something quieter and more final. She looked at him the way you look at something that was once a source of significant pain and has since been reclassified. Balthazar, she said. His name in her mouth, without any of the professional modulation she had always applied to it. Just the word itself, flat and identifiable as a weather report. He had prepared something. He was aware, standing in front of her, that whatever he had prepared was not going to be adequate, and that adequacy was in any case not the point, and that the gap between those two understandings was something he was going to have to cross in real time with whatever he actually had available. "I know," he said. She waited. "I know what happened. I know what Falk did. I know what you were doing that night." He stopped. The rain was very consistent behind him. "I know what I did." Her expression did not change in the way he had perhaps, beneath all rational expectation, hoped it might. She did not move toward him. She did not alter the angle of the door. "You drove 40 minutes in the rain," she said, "to tell me that you know." "I drove 40 minutes in the rain too." He stopped again. The sentence had several possible endings and none of them were sufficient, and he was beginning to understand that the problem was not the endings but the sentence itself. That there was no formulation of what he had come here to say that was proportionate to what he had done, and that arriving here and attempting to speak it anyway was either the bravest thing he had done or the most arrogant, and he was not certain, standing on this porch in this rain, that he was positioned to make that determination. "To ask you something you have no obligation to give me," he said finally. "No," she said. "I don't. I know that." "Do you?" Not a question. An examination. She looked at him the way she had always looked at problems, from the perimeter inward, mapping the edges first. "You knew I wasn't someone who lied. You knew it. I watched you build 7 years of evidence of it and then set all of it aside in 48 hours because the alternative required more from you than certainty did." He had nothing to put against this because it was precisely accurate. "I hope your empire is worth the quiet," she said. The line landed without heat, which was the thing about it that would stay with him longest, the absence of venom, the way she said it as a simple and considered observation rather than an attack. It was the verdict of someone who had finished the trial internally and was merely reading the finding aloud. "I genuinely do. Because it is what you chose." "I chose wrong," he said. "Yes." The rain. The light from the window behind her. The small, unbridgeable geography of the doorway between them. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," he said. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I came because you deserve to hear it from me directly and not through lawyers or an industry announcement or a carefully worded statement that my communications team made palatable." He paused. "I came because I needed to stand in front of you and say it without the glass between us." She looked at him for a long moment. The distance of the doorway did not change. "You've said it," she said. And then she closed the door. Not violently, not with the punctuation of a slammed frame. Simply, quietly, with the same precision she brought to everything, she closed it, and the light from the window remained, and the rain remained, and Balthazar stood on the porch of the house she was temporarily inhabiting and understood that this was not the end of what he owed her. It was, at best, the beginning of the accounting. He came back. This was perhaps the first thing he had done in the entire sequence of events that surprised her, and Illyria's soul had spent enough time in the preceding weeks making an inventory of surprises, cataloging them the way you catalog damage after a flood, methodically, without sentiment, because sentiment is a luxury that belongs to people whose foundations are still intact, that she noticed the surprise for what it was and filed it accordingly. She did not know what to do with it yet. She set it aside and continued. He came back 4 days after the porch. Not to the door this time. She became aware of him the way you become aware of a change in atmospheric pressure, before it is visible, because 7 years of occupying adjacent spaces to a person calibrates you to their particular frequency whether you consent to the calibration or not. He was parked on the street. She saw the car from the kitchen window at a little past 8 in the morning, a vehicle that was conspicuously understated in the way that very expensive things sometimes are, and she stood with her coffee and looked at it for a moment and then looked away and did not go to the door. He did not knock. He sat in the car for perhaps 30 minutes and then drove away. She told herself this meant nothing and went back to the work she had been doing, a consulting framework she was building for no client in particular, the professional equivalent of moving furniture in an empty house, because the alternative was stillness, and stillness, she had found, was the condition under which the preceding months became loudest. She worked. She did not think about the car or the man in it or the 40 minutes of rain from 4 nights ago. She was very disciplined about this. She had become, in the weeks since the cardboard box, extremely disciplined about a great many things. He came back again 2 days later. This time he knocked. She answered because not answering required a kind of active avoidance that was itself a form of engagement, and she had decided, with the same perimeter inward logic she applied to everything, that engagement on her own terms was preferable to the performance of absence. She opened the door to the precise distance she had opened it before. She had not planned this exactness. She noted it anyway. He looked better than he had in the rain, which was a low threshold, and worse than she had ever seen him in 7 years of daily proximity, which was a higher one. He had not, she assessed in the flat professional way she was currently applying to most incoming data, been sleeping. There was a quality to him that she did not have a clean word for, not diminished exactly, because Balthazar Rowe was constitutionally incapable of diminishment in the way that certain structures are constitutionally incapable of it. It is simply not in the material but something altered, as if the Roman statue had developed weather. "I'd like to talk," he said, "if you'll let me." "We talked," she said. "You let me say what I came to say, and then you closed the door." "Yes," she said. "That's what talking looked like that night." He absorbed this without visible reaction, which she recognized as one of his more practiced skills. "I have information," he said, "about the investigation, about what I've done to correct it. I thought you deserved to know the specifics." She considered this. The information was abstractly relevant to her. The condition of her professional reputation was a material fact, not a sentimental one, and she was not so committed to distance that she would refuse practical information on principle. That would be a different kind of indulgence. I'm listening, she said. She did not move from the doorway. He told her about Falk, about the terminal on floor 38, about Mercer's reconstruction and the credential mirroring and the facilities contractor and the vendor identity at the technology audit. He was concise and thorough, and he presented it the way he presented everything, in order, without embellishment, with the evidence prior to the conclusion. She listened and felt several things she did not display and filed accurately under their correct headings. Vindication, which she had known was coming eventually and which arrived without the relief she might have predicted, because the knowing had preceded the confirmation by long enough that the confirmation was structural rather than emotional. Fatigue. And underneath both, something she was still in the process of naming, which was not grief exactly and not anger, and was closer to the feeling of standing in a room where something has been broken and looking at the pieces on the floor and understanding that the energy required to restore it is simply not something you currently have available. I've engaged a separate forensic firm, he said, independent of Mercer. The full report will be submitted to the industry regulatory body with a formal statement that the original findings were flawed. Your name will be cleared through the same channels it was damaged. He paused. I've also contacted Mercer and Cole and Halloway Group directly. She looked at him. You called the firms that rejected me. Yes. To tell them you were wrong. Yes. She thought about Balthazar Rowe calling the partners at Mercer and Cole and saying those words in that order, and felt something that might, in a less careful woman, have become something else and which she allowed to exist briefly before setting it on the shelf beside the rest. Thank you, she said. The words were precise and genuine and did not carry more weight than she intended. That's the correct action, and I'm glad you're taking it. He looked at her for a moment. That's all. What else would there be? Illyria. I want to be clear about something, she said, and her voice had the quality it always had when she was presenting a finding she had spent time arriving at. Not unkind, not heated, simply accurate. I don't hate you. I want to be explicit about that because I think you may have come here expecting a particular kind of emotional scene and I don't have one for you. I'm not angry in the way that would be satisfying to witness. I'm not sad in the way that would make you feel the appropriate measure of guilt. I'm not anything, particularly, that has you at its center. She paused. I think that might be harder to sit with than the alternative, but it is what is true. He was quiet for a moment. When did that happen? Gradually, she said. And then entirely. She looked at him without hostility and without warmth and with the steady, clear attention of someone who has reclassified a thing and is comfortable with where it now sits. You occupied a great deal of space in how I understood my own life for a long time. That is true. I won't rewrite it. But space vacates. It fills with other things, or it becomes simply space, which has its own uses. He looked at her as if she had said something that required a longer response than he currently had access to. I don't know how to do this, he said. It was the most unguarded sentence she had ever heard from him, and she noted that too, the strangeness of it, the way it landed differently than it would have in the boardroom on the 43rd floor, in a different November at different rain. I know, she said, not without compassion. But without the accommodation that compassion might once have led her to extend automatically. That is something you'll have to figure out. She closed the door. Quietly, the same as before. She stood in the hallway of her temporary house and listened to his footsteps on the porch and the path and then the street, and she breathed with the steadiness of someone who has done the harder work of this already, alone in the weeks when no one was watching, and looked at the closed door for a moment before returning to the consulting framework she had been building for no client in particular. She worked until the light changed. She did not think about the footsteps. She was extremely disciplined about this. The statement ran to 4 pages. Balthazar had written it himself, which was not how these things were ordinarily done. The communications team existed precisely to stand between him and the unmediated presentation of difficult facts to the public. But he had dismissed them from the process on the second day, when the third draft arrived and he read it and understood that what they were producing was a document designed to protect him while appearing to expose him, which was a different thing entirely from what this required. What this required, he had concluded, was the truth. In his own syntax, without the load-bearing qualifications that professional communications inserted into apologies the way structural engineers insert expansion joints into bridges, to allow for movement, for the accommodation of stress, for the preservation of the overall form under pressure. He did not want expansion joints. He wanted the thing to be fixed, and he was increasingly certain that fixing it meant accepting that some part of the structure would not survive the process, and that this was not a reason to use softer materials. He sent the statement to his legal team for review on a Thursday evening with a note that said they could flag factual inaccuracies but were not to alter the register or the admission. His senior counsel called him within the hour. The call lasted 11 minutes. Balthazar listened to all of it, thanked him, and changed nothing. The statement was released on a Friday morning, which he had chosen deliberately. Not the Tuesday or Wednesday burial slot that communications teams prefer for difficult news, when the week's attention is diluted and the industry press has other things to process, but Friday morning, when the people who mattered were at their desks and paying attention, and the weekend ahead would give the information time to settle into the industry's understanding without the noise of a subsequent news cycle. Immediately displacing it, it named him. It named Illyria's soul. It named Gerard Falk and Harlan Voss and the terminal on floor 38 and the credential mirroring and the vendor identity at the technology audit 4 months prior to the breach. It documented, in the sequential and unsparing way of a man who had built a career on demanding the standard from other people's reporting, the complete architecture of what had been done to her. And then, in the 4th and final page, in language he had rewritten 9 times before arriving at a version that was accurate without being theatrical, it documented what he had done in response to it. He had believed the false evidence. He had not interrogated it with the rigor he applied to everything else, because the evidence came attached to a name and the name came attached to a wound that was older than Illyria's soul and had nothing to do with her. He had fired her. He had allowed the professional consequences to accumulate without intervention. He had watched her world contract and had told himself, in the careful internal language of a man who needed to believe a particular thing, that this was justice rather than what it actually was, which was the collateral damage of his own insufficient examination. The statement did not use the word sorry. He had drafted a version that did and read it back and removed it, not because he was not sorry, he was in a register he had not previously accessed sorry, but because sorry was a word that functioned in documents like this as a period at the end of a sentence, a signal of completion, and he was not yet at the end of anything. He used instead a formulation that his legal team had flagged and he had retained. I was wrong. The harm was real. The correction must be equivalent. By noon on Friday, the statement had been picked up by every publication that covered the industry, and by 2 in the afternoon it had reached the generalist financial press, and by 4 it had acquired the particular velocity of a story that becomes larger than its industry of origin because it contains within it something that functions outside of professional context. A powerful man saying, in plain language, that he had destroyed someone who did not deserve it, and that the destroying had been his failure rather than hers. His phone produced, in those hours, a volume of communication he did not read. He had given his assistant a list of 4 names whose calls he would take and instructed her to hold everything else. 3 of the 4 names did not call. The 4th was his board chair, who called at 3:40 and spoke for 6 minutes in the measured tone of someone who is deeply concerned and choosing their words accordingly. and to whom Balthazar listened with the same patience he had extended to his legal counsel, and then thanked and returned to what he had been doing. What he had been doing was a secondary document, not for publication, a set of letters, individually written, specifically addressed, to every firm that had rejected Illyria Soul's applications in the weeks following her termination. Not a form letter distributed by his communications team. Not a legal instrument. Letters in his own hand on company letterhead that named what his influence had cost her and requested, with specificity, that her applications be reconsidered in the context of the full and corrected account. He did not ask for guarantees. He did not leverage relationships. He wrote the letters as a man writing a record of a debt, with the understanding that the debt would not be cleared by the writing, but that the writing was nonetheless required. There were 14 letters. He finished the last one at 6:30. Harlan Voss called at 7:15 from a number Balthazar recognized and did not answer. Voss called again at 7:49. At 8 o'clock, Balthazar's legal team informed him that Voss's counsel had been in contact regarding the statement's identification of their client in connection with Falk's activities, and that there was language in the statement that Voss's team considered actionable. Balthazar's senior counsel relayed this with the careful intonation of a man presenting a serious concern. "Tell them," Balthazar said, "that I welcome the opportunity to present the forensic evidence in a formal proceeding." There was a pause on the line. "You understand what that means in terms of the Ardennes timeline?" "Yes." "The regulatory review alone could." "Yes," Balthazar said again. "I understand what it means." He did understand. The Ardennes post-acquisition integration was at a stage where regulatory scrutiny represented a material risk, the kind that would concern his board, his investors, and the analysts who covered the company, with the sustained attention of people who understood that reputation was not separate from valuation but constitutive of it. He understood all of this in the full and specific detail of a man who had built the thing being risked, and he had made the calculation anyway, and the calculation had not been difficult, which told him something about where he currently stood in relation to the person he had been 6 weeks ago. He sealed the 14 letters. He arranged for them to be delivered by hand the following morning, not couriered, not emailed, but carried, because the gesture was the content, and the content required the gesture. Then he sat in his office in the building that still had a pale rectangle on the 43rd floor where a nameplate had been, and he did not feel the specific relief of a man who has done the right thing, because the right thing had arrived approximately 6 weeks too late to carry that feeling with it. He felt instead the particular and appropriate weight of a debt that had been acknowledged but not yet paid, which was, he understood now, exactly what Illyria Soul had meant when she told him she wasn't anything that had him at its center. He was not at the center. He was at the beginning. He had chosen to start. Spring arrived the way it always does in the weeks after a long damage. Not dramatically, not with the declarative suddenness that the word suggests, but incrementally, in small and almost embarrassing increments of light and temperature that you notice only in retrospect, when you look up one morning and understand that the thing has already happened while you were paying attention to something else. Illyria noticed it from the window of an office she had not expected to occupy. Mercer and Cole had called in the second week after the statement. Not the junior partner who had sent the original rejection, but the senior managing partner himself, in the slightly overcorrected tone of a man who is aware he is making a call he should have been positioned to make sooner. She had listened, asked 3 questions, and taken 24 hours before responding. She had accepted a role that was 2 grades above the position she had originally applied for, which she understood was not generosity but arithmetic, the firm's calculation of what her rehabilitation was worth to their own positioning. She accepted it with clear eyes and no particular gratitude, because clarity and gratitude were different instruments and this situation called for the former. She had not told Balthazar. She was aware that this was itself a choice, that he would learn it eventually through the industry channels that delivered all such information, and that not telling him was a form of communication, a delineation of the geography between them. What he had done, the statement and the letters and the forensic submission to the regulatory body, had been correct. She had said so when his assistant had called on his behalf to inform her of the statement before its release, and she had meant it, and she had also meant the silence that followed, which was not ingratitude but boundary, and which she suspected he understood, because Balthazar Rowe was, whatever else he was, not a man who misread the precise weight of a silence. He did not call. He did not appear on her street. He sent, 3 weeks after the statement, a single envelope delivered by hand to her temporary address. She noted he still had it, noted Mercer's continued usefulness to him, noted all of it without particular heat, which she opened at the kitchen table with her coffee and found contained a single page. Not a letter exactly. A document. The forensic firm's final report summary, with the regulatory body's formal acknowledgement of its receipt clipped to the front. Below it, in his handwriting, not a signature, not a closing, just the words themselves, "This is now on record. It will not be undone." She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had filed it in the folder she was keeping of things that were now true, which was a different folder from the one she kept of things she was still deciding about, and she had returned to her coffee, which had gone slightly cold, and finished it anyway. She moved back to the city in April. A proper lease this time, an apartment in a building with good light and a view of nothing particularly significant, which suited her. She assembled it slowly and without urgency, choosing things because she wanted them rather than because they were available, and the process of it, the deliberate room-by-room construction of a life on terms she had set, was something she had not expected to find as stabilizing as she did. She ran into him in May. Not by arrangement, not by any detectable orchestration on his part. Though she observed the coincidence with the perimeter inward attention she applied to all incoming data and assigned it a probability and then set the probability aside because it didn't change what was happening, which was that Balthazar Rowe was standing at the same coffee counter in the lobby of a building where they had both apparently arrived for different meetings, and he had seen her and she had seen him, and the distance between them was approximately 8 feet and contained several months of unspoken material. He looked better than he had in the rain. He looked different than he had ever looked in the office. She assessed this and identified the variable after a moment. He was not performing anything. The boardroom register, the particular quality of his attention when it was being deployed professionally, the managed presentation of a man who had spent decades understanding that how you occupied a room determined what the room gave you, none of it was present. He was simply standing at a coffee counter in a building lobby, slightly early for something, and he had seen her, and he looked like a man who was aware that he did not know what the next 30 seconds required of him. She found this, to her own mild surprise, not unwelcome. "Illyria," he said. Her name still. Just the word. "Balthazar," she said. A pause that was not uncomfortable in the way their previous pauses had been, which had been laden with the specific weight of things being deliberately unsaid. This one was simply a pause, the natural breath between one thing and the next. "Mercer and Cole," he said. "I heard. It's the right fit." "Yes," she said. "It is." He nodded. He collected his coffee from the counter, and she observed that he did not attempt to fill the space with the supplementary language that lesser men would have deployed, the elaborated congratulation, the self-referential pivot, the bid for acknowledgement that his letters and statement had contributed to the outcome. He simply received the information and confirmed it and let it stand. She thought about the November boardroom. She thought about 5:47 in the morning. "I have 12 minutes before my meeting," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I have 15. They sat at one of the lobby tables. Not the instinctive power geometry of every previous meeting they had occupied together. No one at the head, no angle that suggested hierarchy or report. Just two people at a small table in a building lobby with coffee going warm between their hands, and 12 minutes. And the accumulated weight of everything that had preceded this moment sitting in the air between them, neither brandished nor avoided. He did not ask for anything. This was what she noticed first and kept noticing. He did not structure the conversation toward a destination. He asked, with the careful and genuine attention of someone who has learned that questions are not always instruments, how the transition back to the city had been. He listened to the answer. He told her, when she asked, that the Ardennes integration had survived the regulatory review with more structural integrity than his counsel had predicted, and he said it without the tone of a man reporting a victory, more the tone of a man reporting a fact about something that belongs in the past. She observed the difference and filed it in the correct folder. "You wrote the statement yourself," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. I could tell." She looked at her coffee. "It had your syntax. Is that a criticism?" "No," she said. And then, because she was a woman who had spent enough time in the geography of precise language to understand when a thing needed to be said plainly, it was the right document. "You got it right." Something moved across his face that was not quite relief, because relief implies the removal of a weight, and she understood that he was not yet asking to have the weight removed. It was something smaller and more sustainable. The look of a man who has been told that the foundation, though damaged, is not without salvageable material. Who understands this is not the same as being told it will be rebuilt. Who is choosing, nonetheless, to take it. "I have 11 minutes now," he said. "I have 8, she said. They sat in the remaining minutes without filling them unnecessarily. The lobby moved around them, people arriving, departing, performing the ordinary commerce of a Tuesday in May, and they occupied their small table in it with the particular quality of two people who are not yet anything newly defined but are no longer only what they were. When she stood to go, he stood also. Old habit or something newer, she did not parse it. "The lobby on the 4th, he said, "of Meridian House. There's something I'd like your perspective on. Professionally. A beat. If you're available." She looked at him. He held the look without leaning into it, without pressing, with the steadiness of a man who has learned, at considerable cost, the difference between asking and requiring. "Send the documents to my office," she said. "I'll look at them." She left first. She did not look back. Not from avoidance but from the simple forward momentum of a woman who had rebuilt her life with considerable effort and was not in the habit of interrupting her own direction. But she was aware, as she moved through the lobby and into the bright, unremarkable morning of a city that had continued regardless, of the particular quality of the silence behind her. It was not the silence of a closed door. It was, she thought, the silence of something that had not yet been said, and was, for the first time, patient enough to wait. And just like that, the record is corrected. The lobby is behind them. The silence, for the first time, has room to breathe. But a man who is learning to be worthy is not the same as a man who has arrived. And a woman who has rebuilt herself from the ground up does not open doors all at once. Balthazar and Illyria's story is only just beginning to show what it is made of. If this world held you, if you felt the cold of that boardroom, the rain on the porch, the weight of a cardboard box that was never full enough, then you already know what to do. Like this video. It tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be found. That slow burns and hard truths and love that has to earn itself back matter. Subscribe to the channel. Because the Roman statue is just one room in a house full of them. And behind every door is a world that will keep you up past midnight and rearrange something quietly inside you. And drop a comment below. Tell me, Were you rooting for Illyria from the moment she closed that door without slamming it? Or did Balthazar have you from the rain on the porch? Because I need to know which side of this you were standing on. And tell me if you want a part two. Because the vault is not empty. The next story is already waiting. Don't miss it.